Hello, everybody, and welcome to From Poverty to Progress, the channel that promotes an awareness and understanding of human material progress. My name is Michael Magoon. I am the author of the From Poverty to Progress book series. The first book in my book series is entitled From Poverty to Progress, and it explains the origin and causes of modern progress. My second book, which I am happy to announce is now available on pre-release, is called Promoting Progress, a radical new agenda to create abundance for all. I take the lessons learned from the theories in the first book and apply a concrete progress-based reform agenda to promote widely shared economic growth for all. Today I'm going to explain the meanings of the words diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, 10 years ago, very few people knew about what these words meant, except for diversity, which has been around for a while. But now the terms are everywhere, and I find that an awful lot of people don't really understand what they mean and are interested to know more. Even people who use the terms regularly don't quite know what those terms mean. But first, what does this have to do with progress? This channel is about understanding human material progress. And I believe, and I've made the case in a number of other videos, that ideology is one of the major barriers to future progress. I believe in what I call a progress-based perspective, which is that to make the world a better place, we must first understand the world as it actually is, not as we want it to be. 2, the most significant barrier to our understanding of the world are our own preconceived notions. And 3, ideology is the mother of all preconceived notions. Ideology systematically undermines our ability to focus on what works. The most recent type of ideology that has come out is based on the terminology of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This comes originally from critical theory, and it's more commonly known as woke. And these three terms are key concepts in a new form of leftist ideology. It's very important to understand that each term is carefully crafted to undermine the moral legitimacy of merit-based decision-making in our institutions. Today, we take our relatively meritocratic society for granted. For virtually all of human history, humans were born into a certain position of life, and most were trapped in those circumstances for their entire life. Agricultural societies were stratified by ranks, orders, or castes into which all people were born. No amount of effort would fundamentally change one's circumstances. Occasionally, some extraordinarily talented person could break into the upper classes, and presumably some people with mental or physical disabilities would plummet, but these were rare exceptions. In traditional societies, everyone understands that only the children of aristocratic families can fill the leadership positions in political, economic, religious, and military institutions. While there are often intense competition between members of the upper class, no one believed that the members of the lower class could enter that competition. This kept the talent pool very small and undermine the effectiveness of all institutions in society. In traditional societies, the key question was not, what can you do? It was, who is your family or your patron? It was only when you gave a satisfactory answer to the latter question that anyone would bother to think about the first question. Few questioned the natural order, and those who did were not invited into the halls of power. So each of these words, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are carefully chosen to sound nice, but have a very different hidden meaning. One meaning is used in public debates, in the media, in public relations for organizations, and in damage control after public scandals. But there's a deeper hidden meaning for each one of these terms that is implemented by bureaucracy behind closed doors. This makes it very easy for supporters of diversity, equity, and inclusion to pretend they're doing one thing when they're actually doing a very different thing. While these three terms are very different from terminology in the past, from a high-level perspective, they share the leftist worldview, which is very binary. They believe that all of human history is the zero-sum struggle between groups. Every person is a member of either the oppressor group or the oppressed group. And the lopsided result of this group struggle, in other words, the oppressor winning, explains all of the differences in outcome between people. Now, this idea originally comes from Karl Marx. He made it very clear in the Communist Manifesto that this is how he saw the world. But hidden behind this binary view, there's actually a third group, and this is what I call the saviors. Now, the saviors look outwardly like they're members of the oppressor group, but they stand with the oppressed group. And the saviors identify themselves to each other with their moral fervor, their terminology, their dress, their hairstyle, and their consumer purchases. This creates a powerful group identity. You become a savior by endlessly repeating the terminology of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you agree with the policies of people who use the same terminology. Now, it's important to point out that most people who use these terms don't even understand what they mean. And we'll get into why that's the case a little bit later. Critical theory did not invent this idea of a savior group. In fact, it comes from Vladimir Lenin. What is to be done? Essentially, the problem that Lenin identified before World War I is that the working class were not becoming spontaneously revolutionary in the way that Karl Marx predicted, and that he believed that we need to form a vanguard, a dedicated group of revolutionary intellectuals who struggle to overthrow the system. The fundamental problem from a Marxist perspective is that the oppressed, i.e. the working class, had developed a false consciousness. In other words, they had views that were contrary to reality because they've been tricked by the upper classes. So they cannot struggle for themselves. The vanguard understands the world better than the oppressed and works on their behalf. So now that we understand the overall worldview of critical theory, let's take a look at the individual terminology. The first and most important is the term equity. Now, it sounds really good. It sounds like equality and fairness. Who could be opposed to that? But if you look carefully at what it actually means in their lexicon, it means that in order to make up for past discrimination, we must discriminate against members of the oppressor group and in favor of members of the oppressed group. They believe that it is actually immoral to treat people the same because they're not the same. It depends on what group they're in. Individuals must be treated differently based upon their group membership. So you can see that it's actually very different from what most people think of as equality and fairness. Now, the concept of equity has a serious amount of problems because it assumes that all differences between individuals are based on a certain demographic characteristic. But in fact, differences in outcome between individuals are caused by dozens of different factors. Among them are culture, geography, genetics, age, family structure, the individual preferences of a person, the life choices an individual makes, and the amount of work over their lifetimes. The concept of equity also ignores the obvious fact that the beneficiaries of equity-based discrimination are typically the affluent within the oppressed groups. It's not blacks overall that benefit from equity. It is the most highly educated and highest income blacks. It's not the poorest women who benefit from equity-based discrimination. It is the most highly educated and the highest income. The poor within the oppressed groups get virtually nothing except empty rhetoric. Now, the concept of equity is very useful. In fact, it's central to critical theory because it justifies discrimination. The left can bully any organization to redistribute money and jobs to their followers using the concept of equity. And they can also give material incentives to the oppressed groups who don't even agree with them while having other people pay the bill. So without equity, the entire system will collapse. The second concept is diversity. Now, diversity has been around for quite a while. It started out a little bit in the 1970s, and then it really started to take off in the 80s and 90s. But over that time, it's really changed in how the terminology is used. Now, diversity sounds great, right? It sounds like we should appreciate and accept the differences between people. Who can be against that? But if you look at the actual meaning in the leftist lexicon, it means that in any group of people, one has to be hyper-focused on the demographic category that each individual fits in. This denotes whether they are oppressors or oppressed. So it's not the individual that matters, it's only the group within which they fall. Now, ironically, by focusing on the groups, you're actually undermining diversity. Because yes, you focus on the diversity between groups, but then you ignore all the diversity within groups. If you did that, then you would quickly move down to the individual level, which is exactly what they don't want to do. Even more to the point, they ignore that diversity inevitably leads to inequality. So you can't believe in equality and diversity at the same time. Diversity inevitably leads to different preferences between people. Those preferences lead to different life choices, which then lead to different outcomes, which, when you have different outcomes, you inevitably have inequality. So you really have to choose between diversity and inequality instead of pretending that they're one and the same. The concept of diversity prescribes very important differences to the outward appearance between groups, but no real substantive differences between the groups. In other words, it's fine to focus on how someone looks, but to say that any of those differences actually lead to differences of outcome is not allowed to be talked about. So if there's no real substantive differences between the groups, why should we care about diversity? The whole system falls apart. Either the differences matter or they don't matter. The concept of diversity also ignores that an individual is not summed up by their membership within a group. Individuals are unique and are influenced by many competing group memberships. You can be a male, you can be an American, you can be a member of a trade union, you can be a member of a specific corporation, or live in a specific community, or you can be a father. All of these things have a different impact on you. And most importantly, no individual represents a group. The individual just represents themselves. So you can say, we need more of a specific kind of person, but ultimately you have to select an individual, and that individual does not represent the overall group. And diversity treats all members of a group as identical, which is almost never true. For example, the category of blacks lumps together descendants from slaves in America, also descendants from free persons in America, recent immigrants from Africa, recent immigrants from the Caribbean, rich blacks, professional class blacks, working class blacks, and poor blacks. Now, all those people have some things in common, but they also have many differences between them, and some are far more likely to benefit from equity-based discrimination than others. This is even more true for the concept of Hispanic. The term Hispanic lumps together descendants from at least 26 different nations, each one of them with their own unique culture. And they don't think of themselves as Hispanics. They think of themselves as El Salvadorian or Guatemalan or Peruvian or Brazilian or Argentine. It also includes ethnic Spanish who settled in New Mexico before the United States was even formed. It includes families who have lived in the United States for centuries, as well as recent immigrants, rich Hispanics, working class Hispanics, and poor Hispanics. And also, it ignores the fact that the term Hispanic is actually an amalgamation of the Spanish, Portuguese, blacks, and a wide range of Native American tribes. The concept of Asians is also lumps together a huge variety. There are descendants from dozens of different cultures. And if you include ethnic minorities within Asia, you're talking about hundreds, potentially even thousands, and each one of them have very little in common other than the fact that their ancestors once lived on a specific continent. It includes families who have lived in the U.S. for centuries, recent immigrants, rich Asians, poor, professional class Asians, and poor Asians. Nor is the term Native American particularly useful. It lumps together 574 federally recognized tribes, each with a unique culture. So we see again and again that in the name of diversity, very different people are lumped together into one group, which is actually the opposite of diversity. And this concept is getting more and more outdated because it ignores the huge number of people who have ancestors from different groups. 10.2% of all married couple households are interracial, and that number is increasing. For example, in 2015, 17% of all newlyweds were married to someone of a different race. And the interracial marriage rates for newlyweds is 27% for Hispanics, 29% for Asians, and 18% for blacks. For native-born Hispanics and Asians, the rate is around 50%. That means without continual immigration, these categories will disappear within a few generations. I personally think this intermarriage is a really good thing, but it completely nullifies the concept of diversity. So why do they use it? Well, the concept is useful because it forces everyone to focus on the group, not the individual, which is where we should be focused. Once you focus on the group rather than the individual, you are led down the wrong path. Once you focus on individuals, the entire DEI worldview falls apart. The third concept is called inclusion. Now, again, it sounds really nice. Accepting everyone in the group for who they are. Who could argue with that? I certainly don't. But that's not what it actually means. What it actually means is that in public, we may only use approved left-wing terminology. For example, diversity, equity, and inclusion. All other terminology, by definition, causes harm to members of historically oppressed groups. Now, this concept of inclusion ignores the harm caused by free speech by leftists themselves. They're not helping the oppressed in any way by focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but by definition, anyone who disagrees with them is causing harm. The term inclusion justifies punishing those who speak up against the left and enforces obedience within the oppressed. So the harm being caused is not to oppressed groups. The harm being caused is to leftists and their worldviews by speaking the truth, and they don't want that. The concept of inclusion is very useful because it justifies censorship. This shutdowns debate and makes contradictions within the ideology invisible. This creates the illusion that everyone else agrees with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And peer pressure is an awful lot of what's going on here. Peer pressure to speak certain words and peer pressure to not speak other words. So what it really is, it's a form of psychological manipulation using terminology. And this is very common in religious cults. First of all, religious cults identify the vulnerable, the outcasts, and the naive, who are the most easily manipulated. Then they persuade interest in those people with flowery and welcoming language and a sense of community. Because they have felt like outsiders in the past, now suddenly they meet people who speak words that they understand, that sound good to them, and they have a community for them. And that's what a lot of people want. They encourage the newcomer to view the rest of society as immoral and separate themselves off from all those who use different terminology. And then, of course, they want you to donate resources to the leader of the group. What a surprise. Then, once you're part of the group, if you start to deviate from those group norms, you're harshly punished. And they continue testing your loyalty with constantly changing dictates. Finally, once you've become a long-term member of the cult, the true meaning of the words and the actual goals of the cult are revealed. But first, you have to prove that you're loyal. Now, I'm not saying the woke are the only ones who do this. I think it's actually quite common in many ideologies to do something like this. But it's important to understand what is going on behind the scenes before you fall for it. So that leads to an interesting question. Why do cults succeed if they're so often based on ridiculous assumptions? Cults have a powerful psychological combination of, first, an individual has been rejected from mainstream society, or they've been perceived to have been rejected. They now have a moral purpose, a social network, a group identity, and that group has peer pressure, and finally the fear of being outcast. Once you're a part of it, you don't want to be thrown out, because then you're losing all your friends and your closest relationships. But in the long run, almost all cults fail. The reason is quite simple, because their ideas fundamentally conflict with reality. The dysfunctional ideas of cults sabotage the individual. They sabotage the group, who are inevitably competing with other groups, and they continually push the group further and further away from reality because no intellectual dissent is allowed. I believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion is doomed to failure because it transforms every organizational decision into a highly politicized group struggle. If you can imagine a nation where everyone is fighting everyone else for their piece of the pie, that's what DEI will turn every institution into. The vast majority of individuals can find a reason why they are a member of an oppressed group, and then any individual hired or promoted is done at the expense of another group. So it inevitably makes every hiring decision, every promotion, every firing an intensely political issue. This guarantees that you'll get incompetent employees because they're hired not based on their merit, but based on what group they happen to be part of. It will lead to terrible management because, again, they'll be promoted not for being good at what they do, but for what group they're in. Plus, they'll be making bad decisions of hiring, firing, and promotions. It will lead to very low morale because everyone will know that their effort is not rewarded. It all depends on which group you're in. It will lead to constant anger and resentment and treating every coworker as a political opponent. In reality, all organizations are engaged in a competition for revenue. The more fully an organization embraces the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the greater the dysfunction for the organization. This undermines their ability to compete. So any organization that says, I'm not going to do that DEI stuff, is going to gain a huge competitive advantage over those who do. That leads to an inevitable outcome in the long run. And you know what? The DEI activists don't care. They don't care about the organization. They view all organizations and ideas within modern society as a system of oppression. The organization for them is just a temporary means for acquiring a flow of revenue for themselves and their cause. They will destroy the institution and move on without the slightest sense of guilt. There is an alternative that works. Merit. Remember that the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion are deliberately crafted to undermine the moral legitimacy of the concept of merit. And by merit, I mean having demonstrated an ability or accomplishment that is related to the decision at hand, typically hiring, firing, and promotion. Merit is essentially using a person's past result in a specific field to attempt to predict the likelihood that they will show similar results in a related field. By shifting the focus to merit, we shift the focus from the distribution of income and wealth between groups to the individual's contribution to society or the organization itself. This will, in the long run, increase the overall income and wealth in society and benefit everyone, even those who are members of supposedly oppressed groups. If you'd like to know more on this concept, read my book, Promoting Progress. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please don't forget to subscribe and like. It really helps the channel to grow. If you'd like more resources, I'd recommend going to my website, FromPovertyToProgress.com. With a free email subscription, you get free ebook samples, free audio samples, and you can buy discounted ebooks and audiobooks. If you insist on paying full price, you can get ebooks, paperbacks, and hardcovers at Amazon, or if you're a bookstore or a library, you can get them at Ingram Spark. Audiobooks are available at Amazon, Audible, and iTunes. If you'd like to know more about books related to this content, I'd recommend going to my other website, which is the techratchet.com. It consists of an online library of over 280 book summaries on the topics of technology, history, economic growth, and progress.